You're drifting towards sleep, but before you go under, imagine this. There was once a place so vast, so breathtaking, and so thoroughly erased from the face of the earth that some people say it now exists only in the folds of our imagination. It's called Lemuria, or at least that's what the Victorian scientists decided to name it when they thought they had found proof. A whole continent stretching across the Indian Ocean, binding Madagascar to India like a stone bridge. A bridge for lemurs, of all things. Yes, lemurs. Those big-eyed primates became the mascots of a vanished world. It began as science, the kind drawn up in tidy sketches and written in the polite ink of the 19th century. But it wouldn't stay that way for long. Soon, Lemuria would slip into the hands of spiritualists, occultists, and dreamers, all eager to claim it as humanity's true birthplace. In the space of a few decades, it transformed from a zoological theory into a cosmic epic, complete with crystal cities, psychic powers, and a tragic sinking into the sea. And yet, if you close your eyes now and listen past the hum of your own room, you might hear it. The waves rolling against shores that no longer exist, a faint echo of life that history insists never was. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And tell me, in the comments, where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's only fair you've already let me into your evening. It's tempting to imagine we've mapped the entire Earth, that there are no more white spaces left on the globe. But white spaces aren't always missing land. Sometimes they're missing certainty. And Lemuria's story begins with a time when certainty itself was a fragile thing. The mid-1800s was an era when men in stiff collars would stand in front of painted globes and declare that they understood the shape of the world. And they almost did. Almost. They knew of continents shifting under ancient seas, though they didn't yet understand plate tectonics. They saw patterns in nature, but sometimes mistook coincidence for design. In 1864, the British zoologist Philip Sclater examined the distribution of lemur species and noticed something curious. These primates existed in Madagascar and India, but not in Africa or the Middle East. He proposed the simplest explanation he could imagine. An ancient landmass had once linked the two regions, allowing the animals to migrate freely. This lost land he named Lemuria. It was a tidy solution to a neat little puzzle. But, as you may already suspect, the neatest solutions in science often come unravelled under the weight of new evidence. And sometimes, when a theory slips from science's grasp, it falls into stranger hands. Even as geologists began to doubt Lemuria's physical reality, other minds were dreaming bigger. Writers like Helena Blavatsky of the Theosophical, society didn't see a mere land bridge. They saw the cradle of an ancient, spiritually advanced race. To them, Lemuria wasn't just a place. It was a memory encoded in the human soul. A paradise lost, drowned beneath myth and water. Historians are still debating whether the popularity of Lemuria in the late 19th century was due to genuine curiosity, or the human tendency to romanticize what can't be proven. After all, a land that may never have existed is free to be anything you want it to be. And perhaps that's the real trick of Lemuria. It keeps slipping away from the fingertips of science, only to resurface in the dreams of poets, mystics, and sleepless listeners like you. The Victorian era had a peculiar relationship with mystery. On one hand, it draped itself in the cold, buttoned-up certainty of science. On the other, it couldn't resist peering into shadows and imagining what might be hiding there. This was an age where steamships cut across oceans, telegraphs sent words leaping from continent to continent in seconds, and great iron railways stitched together the British Empire. But it was also an age of séances in candlelit drawing rooms, of illustrated magazines filled with ghost stories, and of scholarly gentlemen producing grand theories about lands that nobody had ever seen. Lemuria slipped into this strange blend of reason and romance like a whisper in a crowded room. When Philip Sclater first proposed it in 1864, he wasn't thinking of ancient crystal cities or psychic adepts. He was thinking of lemurs, small, bright-eyed primates with a knack for surviving on islands. His paper in the Quarterly Journal of Science was polite, restrained, and purely zoological. Madagascar and India, he noted, shared several species of lemurs that weren't found in mainland Africa or the Middle East. Since the idea of continental drift wasn't widely accepted yet, the simplest explanation seemed to be that a now-vanished landmass had once connected the two regions, a landmass sclater called Lemuria. It was, to him, a matter of animal migration. But to the Victorian imagination, it was a door. The 19th century was brimming with exploration fever. You can picture the scenes. In London's Royal Geographical Society, men in dark frock coats gathered around large oak tables, their fingers tracing the pale blue gaps on world maps. The Indian Ocean, vast and relatively underexplored, seemed the perfect canvas for speculation. After all, the Victorians had been raised on tales of the Age of Discovery, Cook, Darwin, Livingstone, and they were trained to believe that mystery was simply undiscovered fact. At first, Lemuria stayed in the polite pages of scientific journals, but then came the storytellers. One of them was Ernst Haeckel, a German biologist and philosopher who embraced Darwin's ideas, but also had a fondness for speculative leaps. In the 1870s, Haeckel suggested that Lemuria might have been the original cradle of mankind, a place where early humans evolved before spreading to Africa and Asia. He offered this without proof, but proof wasn't necessary for an idea to take root in fertile public imagination. From there, Lemuria began to drift. Writers like Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the formidable founder of the Theosophical Society, seized upon it. Blavatsky wasn't interested in lemurs at all. Her Lemuria was populated by a third root race, a towering people with mystical powers, existing long before recorded history. She described them as spiritually advanced but physically different from us, living in harmony until they fell into decadence, leading to their continent's destruction. It's worth noting that Blavatsky's root race theories also carried problematic racial ideas, a reflection of the biases of her time, something historians still discuss with discomfort today. Meanwhile, actual geologists were raising eyebrows. William Thomas Blandford, a respected British geologist, had indeed found plant fossils in far-flung locations, suggesting some ancient connection between continents. But he leaned toward explanations involving now-submerged land bridges or island chains, not entire lost continents. The debate simmered. Was Lemuria a vast, coherent landmass, or just a chain of islands worn down and swallowed by the sea? Geologists had no definitive answer. Plate tectonics as a theory wouldn't arrive until the mid-20th century, but their doubts couldn't compete with the allure of a perfect lost paradise. Here's an odd fact from this period. In 1882, a London newspaper ran a satirical letter from an anonymous resident of Lemuria who claimed to be writing from the depths of the Indian Ocean, reporting that life was quite agreeable beneath the waves, and that the Lemurian post service was far superior to the British one. It was meant as a joke, but the fact that readers immediately understood the reference shows how embedded the idea had become in the public mind. Historians are still debating whether Lemuria's popularity in the Victorian era was more about genuine curiosity or the escapist fantasies of a society grappling with rapid change. By the late 19th century, industrial cities were choking on coal smoke, rural traditions were fading, and Darwin's theory of evolution had unsettled centuries-old religious beliefs. A lost continent offered something comforting, the possibility of a purer, untouched world, unspoiled by factories and moral uncertainty. But this comfort also had a colonial undertone. Many Victorians believed in a civilizing mission, and the idea of Lemuria as a forgotten homeland conveniently framed certain colonized peoples as long-lost cousins. Exotic, yes, but connected by some ancient tie. This was not science. It was cultural narrative disguised as science, and it stuck. Even serious scientific societies, while skeptical, didn't always push back strongly. Without satellite mapping or a clear understanding of seafloor geology, there was room to believe, or at least to not disbelieve. Some maps of the period even began to show faint outlines of hypothetical continents in the Indian Ocean, shaded in pale grey like a ghost that might or might not be there. You might think of it like this. The Victorian world was hungry for connection. They were connecting continents with telegraph wires, shipping lanes and railways. Why wouldn't they also imagine that nature had once done the same, linking distant lands with a now-lost bridge of stone? And so Lemuria, born from the careful observations of a zoologist, was passed from scientist to philosopher, from philosopher to mystic, and from mystic to the broader public. Each step reshaped it, adding layers of romance, ideology and speculation. It's as if the continent itself was shifting, not through geological forces, but through the movements of human thought. By the end of the century, Lemuria had become more than a scientific curiosity. It was a cultural phenomenon. It appeared in serialized fiction, in travellers' tales, in speculative lectures held for small-town audiences. It was invoked to explain everything from the spread of ancient languages to the similarity of certain megalithic structures. And yet, beneath it all, there was still no concrete evidence. Perhaps that was its secret strength. A continent without evidence is a continent without limits. No photograph can spoil it. No archaeological dig can define it. It could be anything. A cradle of humankind, a utopia lost to the waves, or simply a lovely dream to drift on as you fall asleep. And maybe that's why, even now with our high-resolution maps and deep-sea scans, we still talk about Lemuria. Not because we believe it, but because, deep down, we wish we could. Philip Sclater probably never imagined that his tidy zoological theory would snowball into one of the most enduring lost continent legends of the modern age. In fact, if he'd known how far Lemuria would wander from his original idea, he might have been mildly horrified, or at least amused in the way a professor is when his lecture notes get turned into a best-selling romance novel. But the truth is, the seed he planted in 1864 didn't just take root in scientific soil. It found its way into the wild garden of public imagination, where facts and fantasies tend to cross-pollinate. The story began with a scientific puzzle, the strange distribution of lemurs. These animals, with their haunting eyes and nimble hands, lived in Madagascar and India, yet were missing from the vast stretches of mainland Africa and the Middle East. To Sclater, this hinted at an ancient land connection. Remember, this was before the concept of continental drift gained acceptance. Alfred Wegener wouldn't publish his ideas until 1912, and even then the scientific establishment would take decades to warm to them. So in the 1860s, the notion of whole continents moving around like ice floes was considered absurd. A sunken land bridge, however, that sounded much more reasonable. It's easy to picture Sclater hunched over his desk in the soft light of an oil lamp, surrounded by books on zoology and paleontology, plotting animal distributions across his globe. He wasn't a man of wild speculation. He was methodical, precise. And yet, with one word, Lemuria, he opened the door for an entire parallel universe of myth. Soon after, Ernst Haeckel, the German biologist known for his gorgeous illustrations of microscopic life, took Sclater's idea and ran with it, perhaps a little too far. Haeckel was fascinated by human evolution and believed that Lemuria might have been the original cradle of humanity itself. He even suggested that this lost land could have been home to the missing link between apes and humans. It was an elegant theory in its time, a now sunken continent in the Indian Ocean, sheltering early humans before geological upheaval scattered them to the corners of the earth. Here's where things take an odd turn. In the 1870s, Haeckel's speculation found an eager audience among not just scientists but occultists and spiritualists. The Theosophical Society, founded by Helena Blavatsky, quickly adopted Lemuria into its cosmology. According to Blavatsky's sprawling and often bewildering writings, Lemuria was the home of the third root race, a people who were androgynous at first. later developing distinct sexes and possessing extraordinary psychic abilities. These beings, she claimed, could manipulate matter with their minds and lived for thousands of years. Theosophists describe their downfall in terms eerily similar to biblical or flood myths: a moral decline, a catastrophic event, and a great sinking beneath the waves. What's fascinating here is that we see the same pattern that would later happen with Atlantis. A modest scientific idea is taken over by mystics, reshaped into a grand spiritual drama, and then fed back into popular culture as if it were ancient fact. Historians are still debating whether this transformation was a deliberate act of myth-making or simply the natural evolution of an idea in an age hungry for wonder. Meanwhile, actual science was beginning to catch up in some ways, though not always to Lemuria's benefit. Geological expeditions in the Indian Ocean began to map undersea ridges, like the Mascarene Plateau, which runs from the Seychelles to Mauritius. Some saw these as tantalizing hints of a drowned continent. Others argued they were volcanic in origin, not remnants of a vast landmass. The debate was never settled in the 19th century, leaving Lemuria floating in a foggy in-between state, too possible to dismiss outright, too unproven to fully accept. An odd footnote to this period involves an 1880s expedition to the Seychelles, where British naturalists found giant tortoises and unique coconut species, like the famed coco de mer, whose massive seeds were often mistaken in Europe for magical artifacts from some Edenic shore. These strange biological finds were eagerly tied to Lemuria by some writers, even though there was no real evidence connecting them. It's a reminder of how easily unrelated facts can be woven into a larger, more romantic narrative. There was also a political angle. In the colonial mindset, tying distant lands together through a shared lost heritage had a certain appeal. It allowed imperial powers to craft stories of ancient unity, conveniently aligning with their own ambitions. In this light, Lemuria was not just a lost continent, it was a symbolic bridge, reinforcing the idea that the British Empire's far-flung territories were, in some deep-time sense, already connected. Yet, even as Lemuria's myth swelled, cracks began to show. Some scientists, like the Scottish geologist Archibald Geikie, were openly sceptical, pointing out that no dredged material from the Indian Ocean indicated a submerged continent of recent geological age. Still, without a firm theory of plate tectonics, there was no equally tidy explanation for the odd distribution of species. The scientific debate simmered, unresolved. Hypotheses began to multiply. Perhaps Lemuria was not a single massive landmass, but a series of stepping-stone islands, now vanished beneath the sea. Or perhaps it was not in the Indian Ocean at all, but somewhere further east or west, its name a wandering label attached to different theories over time. This adaptability kept Lemuria alive. It could move wherever the latest scraps of evidence pointed, and there's something almost poetic in that. A continent that never existed could go anywhere, be anything. It was not bound by rock and soil, but by imagination. By the closing years of the 19th century, Lemuria had one foot in science and the other in the occult. It appeared in learned journals and in the pages of esoteric tracts, in lectures to scholarly societies, and in hushed conversations between believers. Its map was drawn not on parchment, but in the shifting territory between fact and story. And perhaps that's why, as the century turned, Lemuria showed no sign of sinking, at least not in the minds of those who needed it to be real. Maps have always been part truth, part performance. They tell you where mountains and rivers lie, yes, but they also tell you what the mapmaker believes, and sometimes what the mapmaker hopes you will believe. In the Victorian age, when Lemuria began creeping from zoological theory into public imagination, maps were still acts of both science and theatre. The bold black coastlines were fact. The pale grey smudges in the middle of the sea were invitations to dream. Cartographers, of course, were not supposed to indulge in fantasy. The discipline prided itself on precision. Yet there was always that lingering temptation. If explorers returned with rumours of land or strange currents in a certain stretch of ocean, why not mark it, faintly, just in case? After all, oceans were enormous, and ship routes often skirted mysterious zones where compasses faltered or storms rose without warning. By the mid-19th century, phantom islands were already a quiet embarrassment for geographers. Islands like Saxonburg, which had been spotted by multiple ships in the South Atlantic, or the elusive Aurora Islands, claimed by whalers but never confirmed by surveys, would appear and disappear from maps like restless ghosts. Lemuria was different. It wasn't a sailor's mirage or a navigational error, but a theoretical landmass, inferred from science. Still, its presence was just as spectral. Some maps began showing it as a chain of long, tapering islands stretching between Madagascar and India, almost like a jagged backbone rising from the sea. Others hinted at a far grander continent, occupying much of the Indian Ocean, a missing neighbour to Africa and Asia. These outlines were never standardised. One map maker's Lemuria might be another's southern extension, or austral continent, but the implication was the same. Here was a space where land might once have been. The odd fact is, many of these maps were not aimed at scientists at all. They were meant for the public, sold in atlases, printed in magazines, hanging in schools. And once you see something on a map, however faint, it takes on a certain authority. The paper becomes the proof. Meanwhile, the blending of maps and myth wasn't new. Medieval Portolan charts had been filled with sea serpents, strange islands, and notes about waters boiling as if in a pot, early warnings about volcanic zones. The Renaissance age of exploration had left a legacy of creative geography, from the fabled Strait of Anian, a supposed shortcut to the Pacific, to California drawn as an island. In that tradition, Lemuria was simply the next in a long line of cartographic placeholders for the unknown. One of the most interesting surviving examples is an 1886 German world map by Adolf Stieler. In the Indian Ocean, between Mauritius and the Maldives, there's a long irregular landform labelled Lemurian. It looks almost plausible, a modest arc of land that could connect existing islands. The map offers no legend, no explanation. It simply lets the viewer's mind do the rest. Historians are still debating whether such inclusions were the cartographer's cautious nod to current theories, or just a way of keeping their maps competitive in a market hungry for novelty. There's a hypothesis, more psychological than geological, that maps themselves helped keep Lemuria alive as an idea. Seeing it again and again, even without proof, made it feel familiar, almost inevitable. People could picture ships sailing along its coasts, or merchants trading between its harbours and the ports of Ceylon or Zanzibar. The more detailed the imagined geography, the easier it was to forget that this whole thing had started with nothing more than lemur migration patterns. Some enthusiasts began to marry these maps to archaeological speculation. If Lemuria had once bridged Madagascar and India, then perhaps the ruins of its civilization still lay hidden in those lands, not just under the sea but on land, misattributed to other cultures. A few fringe writers claim that certain megalithic structures in Sri Lanka, or mysterious stone alignments in Madagascar's highlands, were Lemurian outposts. Mainstream historians dismissed these connections, pointing out that the sites could be dated and linked to known cultures. Yet the allure persisted. After all, absence of evidence is an open invitation to fill in the blanks with your own story. Oddly enough, even as ship-based surveys improved, the deep Indian Ocean remained largely unmapped below the surface. Sounding lines could give crude depth readings, but without sonar, which wouldn't arrive until the 20th century, vast underwater ridges and plateaus could be hinted at but not fully visualized. These half-glimpses became fuel for the imagination. A rise in the ocean floor here, an unusual trench there. Each could be spun into proof of a drowned continental shelf. One particularly enduring myth came from the interpretation of the Chagos-Laccadive Ridge, a submerged mountain chain running north-south in the Indian Ocean. Some argued it was a remnant of Lemuria's spine. Others, more cautious, suggested it was volcanic in origin, part of the complex geology linked to the Indian plate's slow collision with Asia. The argument was never fully resolved in that era, which in the realm of lost continents is the perfect condition for a legend to thrive. By the closing years of the 1800s, the image of Lemuria on maps had begun to fade as more precise oceanographic surveys were conducted. But by then, it hardly mattered. Once a land mass has been drawn and named, it can live forever in atlases of the mind. Even after it vanished from official charts, Lemuria still existed in the quiet margins, in esoteric diagrams, in the lecture notes of theosophists, and in the ornate fold-out maps tucked into the backs of speculative books. It's worth wondering if this was part of its survival strategy. The moment something leaves the strict realm of science, it becomes harder to kill. In the wild territory of myth and memory, Lemuria could change shape, shift location, and even merge with other lost lands. The maps, whether made by cautious academics or imaginative mystics, had done their work. They had taken a phantom and given it a coastline, and so, while the real ocean floor remained hidden beneath miles of water, the imagined one was drawn and redrawn in countless minds, each map more a portrait of the dreamer than of the sea itself. By the time Lemuria had wandered from Sclater's desk into maps, the next stage of its metamorphosis was inevitable. If a land could be imagined, it could be populated. And if it could be populated, someone would eventually decide that its people were not ordinary mortals, but extraordinary beings. This was the Victorian age, after all, the same century that gave the world séances, table-rapping spirits, and the earnest conviction that the dead could be reached by the careful arrangement of letters on a wooden board. Enter the Theosophists, founded in 1875 by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, a Russian mystic with a talent for grand, sweeping cosmologies. The Theosophical Society claimed to blend ancient wisdom from East and West. In reality, it often reassembled fragments of Hinduism, Buddhism, Christian mysticism, and occult speculation into a heady brew of metaphysics. Lemuria, with its tantalizing name and convenient position between continents, was the perfect blank page for such a worldview. Blavatsky's writings in The Secret Doctrine transformed Lemuria from a vanished land bridge into the stage for an epic chapter of human prehistory. According to her, the Lemurians were the third root race, coming after the ethereal, barely physical beings of the first and second root races. They were vast in stature, anywhere from 10 to 15 feet tall, and possessed powers that would make a modern superhero blush. They could project thoughts across distances, shape matter through will alone, and for a time were entirely androgynous. Sex, she claimed, was a later, almost regrettable development. It's easy to smile at the imagery now, but for many late 19th century readers, this was more than fantasy. It was a vision of a golden age, long before the divisions and conflicts of the present. In a society preoccupied with industrial smoke and political tension, Lemuria became a spiritual refuge, a place to imagine humanity as pure, wise, and intimately connected to the natural world. Theosophists described the Lemurians as living in harmony with colossal fauna, giant birds, reptilian beasts, and marine creatures unlike anything alive today. In some accounts, they built cities of crystal and obsidian, arranged in perfect geometric patterns to harness cosmic energies. In others, they dwelt in sprawling open-air temples where the sky itself was part of the architecture. But there was always a shadow to the story. As with Atlantis, Lemuria's tale ended in decline. Blavatsky and her followers claimed that the Lemurians eventually turned away from their higher purpose, succumbing to material desires and moral decay. The punishment was swift and cataclysmic: earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and a gradual sinking into the sea. Only a few survivors escaped, perhaps carrying fragments of Lemurian wisdom to other continents. Oddly, some of these accounts insisted that Lemurian survivors ended up in the American West, specifically in California's Mount Shasta region. While this might seem absurd, it became one of the most persistent threads in the Lemurian myth, and one we'll return to later. Historians are still debating the degree to which Theosophy's vision of Lemuria was a creative reinterpretation of earlier myths versus an opportunistic appropriation of scientific-sounding theories to legitimize mystical beliefs. What's clear is that Blavatsky's Lemuria was far removed from Sclater's. She had not only peopled it, but also placed it within a cosmic cycle of rises and falls, tying it to karmic law and reincarnation. Theosophy wasn't the only movement to claim Lemuria. Other spiritualists, trance mediums, and esoteric writers began producing channeled material in which they claimed to speak directly with Lemurian spirits. Some of these communications were strangely specific: recipes for herbal remedies, descriptions of lost technologies, even architectural blueprints for structures never seen on Earth. An odd fact emerges from this period. In 1894, a San Francisco newspaper reported that a local clairvoyant had sketched a detailed map of Lemuria while in a trance. The map showed mountain ranges, river systems, and a capital city with a name written in an unfamiliar script. When skeptics asked how she could possibly know such details, she replied simply that she had been there in a past life. The story was printed without irony. Hypotheses about Lemuria's spiritual significance began to multiply. Some claimed it was the birthplace of the human soul itself. Others insisted it was the place where humanity first learned to separate the physical from the spiritual, laying the foundation for all future civilizations. There were even suggestions that Lemuria's downfall was not a tragedy, but a necessary step, the pruning of a branch so that the tree of human evolution could grow stronger. Meanwhile, scientific voices were growing quieter in the Lemurian conversation. As geology advanced, the physical plausibility of a vanished Indian Ocean continent diminished. But science's retreat only left more space for myth. In a curious inversion, Lemuria's weakening in the realm of empirical evidence seemed to strengthen it in the realm of belief. Once freed from the burden of needing to be real, it could be anything its storytellers required. And so, in the parlours of spiritualists, in the pages of theosophical journals, and in the whispered promises of trance mediums, Lemuria thrived. It was no longer just a land. It was a mirror, reflecting back the hopes, fears, and longings of those who dreamed it into being. If you've ever played that game where one person whispers a sentence into another's ear, and the phrase slowly mutates as it passes around the room, you'll understand how Lemuria began to change in the early 20th century. By then, its name had escaped the polite corridors of Victorian science and was drifting through the far noisier hallways of popular imagination. And somewhere along that journey, it ran into another missing continent, one that lived on the opposite side of the world. Its name was Mu. The two lands were, in their beginnings, entirely unrelated. Lemuria had been conjured from the migration habits of lemurs and the pre-plate tectonic desire for neat land bridges. Mu, on the other hand, first appeared in the mid-19th century through the work of Augustus Le Plongeon, a French-American photographer and amateur archaeologist. Le Plongeon claimed that the ruins of the Mayan city of Uxmal told the story of a lost Pacific continent called Mu, which he believed to be the birthplace of all civilization. From there, Mu supposedly sank beneath the waves in a great cataclysm, scattering its people to the far corners of the earth. Two different oceans, two different theories, two different sets of enthusiasts. Yet as the decades passed, the borders between them began to blur. Part of the confusion came from James Churchward, a British occult writer who, in the 1920s and 1930s, published a series of books about Mu that were long on detail and short on evidence. Churchward's Mu was vast, covering most of the Pacific Ocean, home to an advanced civilization with a population in the millions. And here's where the lines began to smudge. Some readers, encountering Lemuria and Mu in the same breath in pulp magazines or speculative lectures, assumed they were one and the same, a single drowned world that stretched from the Indian Ocean into the Pacific, It didn't help that both myths shared certain irresistible features. Both were described as ancient cradles of humanity. Both were said to have fallen due to moral decline and geological catastrophe. And both had a knack for leaving behind just enough evidence to keep the curious from walking away. By the 1930s, you could find maps in fringe publications showing a mega-continent labelled Lemuria, an island empire sprawling from Madagascar to Easter Island. To the untrained eye, it almost looked plausible. There was, after all, the vast sweep of the Indo-Pacific, a single watery expanse that, on a globe, could seem like it was waiting for a landmass to tie it all together. Historians are still debating how much of this merger was accidental and how much was deliberate. It's entirely possible that certain occult writers found it convenient to combine the two legends, creating a grander and more marketable myth. Why sell two lost continents when you can sell one that covers half the planet? Oddly enough, some scientific discoveries were misread to support this fusion. In the early 20th century, geologists identified large undersea features like the Kerguelen Plateau in the southern Indian Ocean and the Ontong Java Plateau in the Pacific. These submerged regions were, in reality, volcanic plateaus formed by tectonic processes over millions of years. But to believers, they looked like the eroded stumps of ancient mountain ranges, the drowned backbone of Lemuria. One particularly strange side note comes from the 1934 publication of The Lost Continent of Mu by Churchward. In it he included supposed translations of ancient tablets from India, which he claimed spoke of a vast land that stretched across what is now ocean. Critics pointed out that these tablets were never produced for examination, and that Churchward's linguistic interpretations were creative to the point of invention. Nevertheless, his books sold briskly, feeding the public's appetite for a single unified lost world. The hypothesis that Lemuria and Mu were the same place gained further traction in the mystical circles of California and Hawaii, where New Age groups were already blending Polynesian mythology with esoteric teachings. Here, the Lemurian survivors of the Indian Ocean were reimagined as voyagers who had sailed east, merging with the people of Mu before both lands sank. It was a tidy way to link myths from both sides of the world into one sweeping saga. There was, however, resistance. A few stubborn theosophists insisted on keeping Lemuria and Mu separate, arguing that they represented different epochs in the spiritual evolution of humanity. To them, Lemuria belonged to the third root race, while Mu, if it existed at all, was merely a regional variant or colony. These disagreements sometimes became surprisingly heated in the pages of occult journals, with each side accusing the other of diluting the truth. The academic world, for its part, largely ignored the debate. By the mid-20th century, plate tectonics had begun to settle the scientific question. Continents drift, collide, and reshape the face of the planet over eons. They do not simply sink wholesale into the sea within the span of human memory. Any resemblances between Madagascar, India, Polynesia, or the Americas were better explained by ancient migration routes, genetic studies, and the movement of tectonic plates than by a vanished supercontinent. And yet, in the world of myth, the merger stuck. Even today, if you wander into certain corners of the internet or the back shelves of a used bookstore, you'll find references to Lemuria, as though it's an established singular entity. The hybrid legend has acquired its own lore, a world where the high priests of Lemuria studied alongside the navigators of Mu, where temples faced both the setting and rising suns, and where the entire Pacific Indian basin was once land before being swallowed by the sea. It's hard not to be impressed by the sheer adaptability of such myths. They evolve like living things, absorbing whatever they touch, merging with other stories until the original seed, a paper on lemur distribution, in Lemuria's case, is almost unrecognizable. The map has changed beyond all recognition, but the name still carries the weight of somewhere that might have been. Stories have a strange way of crossing oceans. They can drift on the currents of trade, hitch a ride in the memories of sailors, or be born anew in distant lands that have never met, only to sound uncannily alike. This is where Lemuria's trail winds into the Pacific, into the scattered constellation of islands whose myths have been carried by oral tradition for hundreds, sometimes thousands, of years. And here is where some believers claim to find echoes of the lost continent in Polynesian memory. The Pacific is a map of survival. Thousands of islands dot an ocean that covers a third of the planet's surface, many so small that you could walk across them in an hour. The people who settled them were master navigators, guided not by compasses but by the stars, the shape of the waves, and the flight patterns of seabirds. By the time Captain James Cook arrived in the 18th century, these voyagers had already linked the Pacific in a network of exploration far older than European contact. Within the oral histories of Polynesian cultures, there are tales of great migrations, of homelands lost to the sea, and of voyages undertaken because the land was no more. In Hawaii, legends speak of Kahiki, a distant place of origin across the ocean. In parts of Micronesia, there are myths of a sprawling island empire that fell beneath the waves after a betrayal angered the gods. In Maori tradition, there are whispers of Hawaii, the ancestral homeland from which their people journeyed to Aotearoa, New Zealand. For most anthropologists, these stories are understood as cultural memory of real migration routes, not evidence of a vanished continent. Yet, to some Lemurian enthusiasts, they sound suspiciously like accounts of survivors. The hypothesis is simple. If Lemuria sank in the Indian Ocean, perhaps some of its people escaped eastward, island hopping until they reached the Pacific, merging with or becoming the ancestors of Polynesian navigators. One of the oddest details comes from Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, famous for its giant moai statues. In the early 20th century, researchers recorded local oral traditions mentioning Hanau Ipe, a people described as taller and heavier than the island's other inhabitants said to have been present long before European contact. To believers, this was a perfect fit for the theosophical Lemurians, tall, powerful, and ancient. Mainstream archaeologists, however, tend to interpret these stories as referring to different social groups within Rapa Nui's own history. Historians are still debating whether the Hanau Ipe were literal outsiders or symbolic figures in the island's mythic framework. Another piece of evidence sometimes cited is the linguistic similarities between words in Malagasy, spoken in Madagascar, and certain Polynesian languages. While linguists attribute this to the Austronesian migration, Malagasy is, in fact, part of the Austronesian language family. Lemurian theorists see it as a trail of breadcrumbs left by survivors moving from the Indian Ocean into the Pacific. In their telling, language itself becomes a kind of raft, carrying echoes of a lost homeland across centuries and seas. The Pacific also holds its share of mysterious archaeological sites. On Nan Madol in Micronesia, a city of massive basalt columns rests atop a coral reef, connected by tidal canals. It's an astonishing feat of engineering for its time, dating from around the 8th century CE. To conventional archaeology, it's the work of the Sodelur dynasty. To Lemurian seekers, it's a remnant of far older skills, knowledge inherited from those who once built in the heart of Lemuria. And then there's the Yonaguni Monument, an underwater rock formation off the coast of Japan. Discovered in 1986, its sharp, terraced shapes led some to claim it's the ruins of a prehistoric city. Geologists are divided. Many see it as a natural formation shaped by tectonic activity and erosion, but a few suggest human modification. It's not in the Indian Ocean, but that hasn't stopped Lemurian believers from folding it into the story, as if the survivors scattered not just across the Pacific but around the whole Ring of Fire. Oddly, the Pacific myths that mention catastrophic floods or sinking lands often carry a note of inevitability. The land doesn't just vanish. It is taken, sometimes as punishment, sometimes as a natural cycle. This tone resonates strongly with the theosophical version of Lemuria, in which moral decline precedes destruction. It's tempting to see these similarities as a kind of convergent mythology. different cultures arriving at similar narratives because the ocean is a constant, unpredictable presence, and islands are vulnerable to both the whims of weather and the deep rumblings of the earth. Historians remain cautious. While cultural parallels can be striking, they are not proof of shared historical events on a continental scale. Still, even cautious scholars admit there's something haunting in the idea that stories from thousands of miles apart can align so neatly, especially when those stories speak of lands that lie somewhere beneath the waves. For those who dream of Lemuria, the Pacific is not a barrier but a bridge. Its islands are stepping stones, its myths are messages, and its people are the living legacy of a world that, officially, never existed. The stars that guided the great Polynesian canoes are the same stars, they say, that once shone over Lemurian shores. And if you stand on a beach at night, with the surf curling at your feet and the horizon dissolving into darkness, it isn't so hard to believe that somewhere out there, just past the edge of the known, another coastline might still be waiting. The trouble with chasing ghosts is that sometimes you end up finding something real, only it isn't what you were looking for. By the early 20th century, the scientific hunt for Lemuria had shifted from drawing speculative coastlines on maps to probing the depths of the Indian Ocean itself. If the continent had existed, surely there would be traces, ridges, plateaus, mountain chains, lurking beneath the surface like bones under a blanket of water. And there were traces, though they didn't behave the way Lemuria's supporters might have hoped. Long before sonar or satellite mapping, oceanographers relied on painstakingly slow methods. A sounding line, a rope weighted with lead, would be lowered from a ship until it touched the sea floor. The depth would be noted, the rope hauled up, and the process repeated at the next coordinate. It was a laborious, almost meditative task, and in the vastness of the Indian Ocean, the gaps between measurements could stretch for hundreds of miles. In these gaps, mystery thrived. One of the first significant underwater features to stir speculation was the Mascarene Plateau, a broad, shallow expanse stretching from the Seychelles to Mauritius and Réunion. Rising steeply from the deep sea, it looked, in the grainy bathymetric maps of the time, like the tattered edge of a drowned land. To geologists, the plateau was volcanic, formed over millions of years as the African plate drifted over a hotspot in the Earth's mantle. But to Lemuria's faithful, it was the surviving mountaintops of a once vast continent. Oddly enough, they weren't entirely wrong, but the truth was more complicated. In 2013, scientists announced evidence of a microcontinent beneath Mauritius, fragments of ancient crust dating back billions of years. This lost fragment, dubbed Mauritia, had indeed been swallowed by the Indian Ocean, but it had broken away from Madagascar during the split of Gondwana, tens of millions of years before humans appeared. It wasn't Lemuria as imagined by Sclater or Blavatsky, but it showed that the ocean could, in fact, hide the wreckage of continents. Historians are still debating how much this discovery should matter to the Lemuria conversation. On one hand, it provides a precedent. Continents can and do disappear beneath the waves over geological time. On the other, Mauritia vanished in the deep past, leaving no chance it harboured psychic giants or a civilization of crystal cities. Other geological ghosts surfaced in the Kerguelen Plateau, a massive volcanic formation in the southern Indian Ocean, sometimes called the Kerguelen continent because of its sheer size. Today it's buried under more than a kilometre of water, but parts of it were above sea level millions of years ago, supporting lush vegetation. Again, it was tempting to think of it as a piece of Lemuria. Again, the dates didn't match. The deeper scientists looked, the more they found, and the less it seemed to line up with the Lemurian myth. The Chagos-Laccadive Ridge, the 90 East Ridge, the submarine mountains of the Carlsberg Ridge, all fascinating, all formed by volcanic and tectonic forces that unfolded over tens of millions of years. If Lemuria had existed in anything like its theosophical form, it would have had to vanish relatively recently in geological terms, and the seafloor showed no signs of such a dramatic sudden collapse. One odd discovery from this period did briefly fan the flames. In 1939, a British survey vessel dredged up chunks of granite from the depths near the Seychelles. Granite, unlike basalt, forms from continental crust, not oceanic crust. The find was intriguing, perhaps even suggestive of sunken continental fragments. But further study suggested these were drop stones, carried to sea by icebergs during ancient glacial periods, then dropped into the ocean as the ice melted. It was an anticlimax, but it fed just enough uncertainty to keep the conversations alive. Hypotheses sprouted to bridge the gap between science and legend. Some proposed that Lemuria was never a single massive continent, but a connected chain of islands, now mostly drowned, that could have served as migration stepping stones for animals and people. Others suggested that Lemuria was real in a different way, not as a distinct landmass, but as a concept describing multiple now vanished pieces of Gondwana scattered across the Indian Ocean basin. This version had the advantage of aligning better with plate tectonics, but it lacked the romance of a unified lost world. And yet the geological findings did something unexpected. They legitimized, in a strange way, the act of looking. Even if Lemuria itself wasn't found, the search uncovered real pieces of Earth's hidden past. Microcontinents like Mauritius, submerged volcanic plateaus, and fossilized coral reefs told their own stories older and stranger than human memory. By mid-century, oceanographic technology had begun to accelerate. Echo sounding replaced weighted lines, allowing ships to map vast stretches of seafloor with unprecedented detail. What emerged was a world of ridges and trenches, seamounts and plateaus, none of which matched Lemuria's imagined silhouette. For many scientists, the verdict was in: there was no geological basis for a recently vanished Indian Ocean supercontinent. But here's the thing: absence of evidence isn't the same as evidence of absence in the minds of those who want to believe. The ocean is still vast, still capable of keeping secrets. Even now, large portions of its floor remain unmapped in fine detail. A myth only needs one gap in the data to slip through. Perhaps that's why, in the eyes of its believers, Lemuria survives the sonar age. The ocean floor has given up many of its ghosts, but a few remain stubbornly hidden, visible only to those willing to keep looking. And if you stand on the shore of Mauritius or Réunion at night, watching the dark horizon, you might understand the temptation to imagine a land out there, not on any chart, but waiting just beyond the reach of the light. If Lemuria had a spiritual capital in the real world, it might be Madagascar. Not because the island holds any ruins of crystal cities or statues of ancient psychic monarchs, but because it sits at the crossroads of the story, a place where real biodiversity, real geology, and real human history have been braided together into a rope strong enough to pull the myth along for more than a century. Madagascar is, in every sense, improbable. It is the fourth largest island on Earth, yet more than 80% of its plant and animal species are found nowhere else. From towering baobabs to the haunting nocturnal aye, the island's life seems to belong to another timeline altogether. For a Victorian zoologist like Philip Sclater, it was the perfect starting point for a mystery. Here were lemurs, so named, incidentally, after the Roman spirits of the dead, the lemias, flourishing on Madagascar and in distant India, but missing from the lands in between. In the 19th century, this distribution was puzzling. Without plate tectonics to explain continental drift, the simplest answer was a now vanished landmass bridging the gap. Sclater's Lemuria was born from that logic, and Madagascar became its western anchor. Modern science paints a more complex picture. Madagascar split from the African mainland around 160 million years ago, and from the Indian subcontinent roughly 88 million years ago, as the great supercontinent Gondwana broke apart. This isolation explains the island's unique biodiversity. Lemurs didn't stroll across a stone bridge from India. Their ancestors likely rafted across the Mozambique Channel on mats of vegetation, an image both more plausible and more absurd than a whole continent sinking. Still, the Victorian mind found it hard to accept such a wild journey by chance. A solid land connection felt neater, cleaner, and more civilized as an explanation. It also played into a broader tendency of the time to imagine the Earth's history as a sequence of grand, sweeping changes, rather than as a messy tangle of small, improbable events. By the late 19th century, Madagascar had become a stage for more than just natural history. Archaeologists and travellers returned with stories of megalithic tombs in the highlands, stone constructions unlike those of surrounding cultures. To local Malagasy people, these were simply part of their heritage. To outsiders primed by the Lemurian myth, they were suspiciously out of place, perhaps relics of a lost, more ancient civilization. An odd fact from this period. In 1893, a French colonial officer reported finding a set of mysterious glyphs carved into a basalt outcrop near the port of Mahajanga. He claimed they resembled characters from South Asian scripts. No rubbings or photographs survive, and later expeditions found nothing similar in the area. Historians are still debating whether the officer misinterpreted natural fractures in the rock, stumbled upon a local petroglyph tradition, or simply fabricated the find to impress his superiors. For Lemurian believers, however, the supposed glyphs were irresistible. Here was a tantalizing link between Madagascar and India, exactly the kind of connection Sclater had imagined. Never mind the absence of hard evidence. In the mythic framework, coincidence is not just acceptable, it is proof. There's a hypothesis among some modern fringe writers that Madagascar was not merely part of Lemuria, but its cultural heartland. In this version of the story, Lemuria was less a single landmass and more a network of islands and peninsulas, with Madagascar serving as the political and spiritual centre. From here, fleets of ships, or, in the more fantastical tellings, fleets of telepathic voyagers, sailed to colonies in India, Southeast Asia, and perhaps even the Pacific. When the cataclysm came, Madagascar remained above water, but its Lemurian civilization collapsed, leaving only fragments absorbed into later cultures. Mainstream historians dismiss this narrative. The archaeological record in Madagascar shows continuous human occupation for only about 2,000 years, with the earliest settlers arriving by outrigger canoe from Borneo in East Africa. There is no sign of an advanced prehistoric civilization predating these arrivals, and yet, for those inclined to see Lemuria in every gap of the record, the absence itself becomes suspicious. Oddly, the island's real history is in many ways stranger than the myth. Genetic studies of the Malagasy people show a roughly equal mix of Southeast Asian and East African ancestry, reflecting voyages across thousands of miles of open ocean more than 1,000 years ago. Linguistic evidence backs this up. Malagasy is an Austronesian language closely related to those spoken in Borneo, with layers of Bantu influence from Africa. To a Lemurian romantic, this fusion of worlds feels almost like the last flicker of a once global maritime culture. And then there is the landscape itself, a place where alien-looking, spiny forests give way to sweeping plateaus and river-cut canyons. In the early morning, when the mist clings to the baobabs and the calls of Indri lemurs echo like something out of a dream, it is not hard to imagine that this is a remnant of some deeper past, a place that remembers more than it should. Historians are still debating how much myths like Lemuria shape the way we perceive real places like Madagascar. On one hand, such myths can inspire interest and wonder. On the other, they risk overshadowing the island's actual history and the achievements of its real people. For the believer, Madagascar is a surviving outpost of a sunken world. For the scientist, it's a geological orphan with a biography written in stone and DNA. Either way, it sits on the edge of two maps, the one drawn by plate tectonics and the one drawn by imagination. And in the narrow strip between them, Lemuria still lingers, half seen in the morning mist. If Madagascar is the western anchor of the Lemurian legend, then southern India is its eastern mirror, a place where another, older myth has taken root, one that blends history, poetry and pride into something that can look suspiciously like the other half of a drowned continent. This is the story of Kumari Kandam. In Tamil tradition, Kumari Kandam is not a fantasy imported from Victorian science. It is a homeland, a lost cradle of Tamil civilization that once stretched far to the south of India into what is now the Indian Ocean. Ancient Tamil literature, especially the Sangam texts, speaks of lands lost to the sea, of 3 great Tamil Sangams, literary academies, that flourished for thousands of years before the ocean swallowed them. In this telling, the loss is not a geological accident, but a cultural tragedy, a severing of the roots of one of the world's oldest living languages. The parallels to Lemuria are obvious. Both are said to be ancient, now sunken. Both connect India to lands far across the water. Both have been woven into larger myths of origins and dispersal. But Kumari Kandam is more than a legend to many Tamils. It's a cultural anchor, a statement that their history stretches deep into prehistory, beyond the reach of colonial timelines and Western archaeology. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as colonial scholars and local intellectuals interacted, Lemuria and Kumari Kandam began to be linked in a kind of hybrid narrative. Victorian scientists like Sclater had placed Lemuria's eastern edge near India. Tamil nationalists saw in this a validation of their own oral histories. If Lemuria once connected India to Madagascar, why couldn't Kumari Kandam have been part of it? Historians are still debating whether this linkage was an organic blending of ideas or a deliberate act of cultural assertion during colonial rule. Some suggest that Tamil intellectuals strategically adopted the Lemurian framework as a way of giving their own traditions a scientific footing in the language of the day. Others argue that it was simply a natural connection, 2 stories about lost southern lands meeting in the middle. The odd fact is that the Sangam literature does contain references to lands being swallowed by the sea. The ancient Tamil text Silapatikaram, for example, tells of the Pandyan king's territory extending far beyond the modern coastline into regions now claimed by the ocean. These are not vague allegories, but specific geographies, complete with place names, rivers and mountain ranges. To modern ears, it sounds like an eyewitness account of rising seas, though whether that reflects myth, memory or poetic invention is open to question. From a geological standpoint, there is some real history behind such flood tales. During the last ice age, sea levels were much lower, exposing land along the continental shelf south of India and Sri Lanka. As the ice melted between 12,000 and 7,000 years ago, the sea reclaimed these coastal plains. Archaeologists have found submerged structures off the coast of Tamil Nadu and Gujarat. Not continents, but hints of ancient shorelines where human settlement was possible. For some, this is enough to suggest that the Kumari Kandam story is a cultural memory of real post-glacial flooding. For Lemurian enthusiasts, it's irresistible to fold Kumari Kandam into the larger myth. In this version, the lost Tamil homeland was part of the eastern arc of Lemuria, connected by fertile plains and rivers to Madagascar and perhaps beyond. Tamil seafarers, they say, carried their language and culture westward, seeding Madagascar and eastward, touching Southeast Asia and the Pacific. It's a grand vision, and one that fits neatly with the Austronesian connections already hinted at in Madagascar's history. The hypothesis has its problems, of course. Linguists can trace Tamil's history back several thousand years, but not tens of thousands. Archaeology shows cultural continuity in Tamil Nadu, without the need for a vanished supercontinent. And plate tectonics gives no evidence for a recent landmass south of India of the size described in Lemurian or Kumari Kandam lore. Still, the 2 myths have been mutually reinforcing for more than a century. In Tamil nationalist thought, linking Kumari Kandam to Lemuria places Tamil culture in a global prehistoric network, rather than isolating it on the subcontinent. In Lemurian circles, Kumari Kandam provides a rich, specific cultural backdrop to a myth that otherwise can feel geographically vague. There's a particularly strange episode from the 1930s when a series of public lectures in Madras, now Chennai, promoted the idea of Kumari Kandam as a historical reality connected to Lemuria. The speakers were a mix of local scholars, nationalist leaders, and even a few Western theosophists passing through. One evening, a projection map was shown with Lemuria stretching from Madagascar to Australia, Tamil Nadu glowing at its northern tip labelled Seat of the First Civilization. The audience reportedly broke into applause. Odd fact, some modern retellings of Kumari Kandam extend it so far south that it brushes Antarctica, connecting yet another fringe theory, that Antarctica was once habitable, to the Lemurian web. The myth is nothing if not accommodating. In the end, whether Kumari Kandam was an ancient memory of coastal loss or an inspired cultural myth, its fusion with Lemuria has left a lasting imprint. For some, it's a romantic gesture of solidarity between cultures separated by oceans. For others, it's a cautionary tale about how myths can be reshaped to fit the needs of the present. And for the believer standing on the southernmost tip of India, watching the waves break over the rocks of Kanyakumari, it's easy to imagine those waters parting to reveal a vast green plain stretching toward the horizon, the lost heart of a world that once connected two oceans. If myths were currencies, Atlantis and Lemuria would be the gold and silver coins of lost continents, different in design, but each carrying a weight that never seems to diminish. They're often mentioned in the same breath, but their origins and the roles they've played in popular imagination are distinct enough to make them feel like rivals, and in a way, that rivalry has kept both legends alive. Atlantis, of course, has the advantage of age. Its roots lie in Plato's dialogues Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BCE, where it appears as a moral allegory, a powerful island empire that grew corrupt and was destroyed by the gods. Over the centuries, the story has been retold so often that it has gathered layers of detail Plato never gave it. Elaborate city plans, crystal domes, even connections to alien visitors in the most speculative retellings. Atlantis is a myth with a fixed starting point, a clear literary origin that scholars can point to, even as they disagree on whether Plato's tale was based on older traditions. Lemuria, by contrast, began not as an allegory, but as a dry scientific hypothesis, an attempt to solve the problem of animal distribution before plate tectonics made that problem vanish. It wasn't born in ancient Greece, but in the mid-19th century, among men in stiff collars and academic societies. Its leap into myth happened later, almost by accident, when theosophists and other esoteric thinkers adopted it as a setting for their own cosmologies. Oddly enough, this difference in origin has shaped how each legend is used. Atlantis has been a cautionary tale from the start, about pride, hubris, and the dangers of technological power. Lemuria, especially in its theosophical form, has often been painted as more innocent, a place of harmony and spiritual advancement undone by forces beyond its control. In the mythic imagination, Atlantis is the tragic villain, Lemuria is the tragic victim. Historians are still debating whether the rise of Lemuria in occult circles was, in part, an attempt to create a counter-Atlantis, a lost continent that could embody ideals rather than serve as a warning. Some evidence for this comes from the way Helena Blavatsky and later theosophists position Lemuria as the home of the third root race, preceding the Atlanteans, the fourth root race, in the grand cycle of human spiritual evolution. In this telling, Lemuria's people were more in tune with nature, less obsessed with conquest, and closer to the divine. Their destruction was not self-inflicted greed, but the cosmic turning of an age. The odd fact is that early theosophical charts sometimes showed both continents existing at the same time, their territories separated by half a world of ocean. The Atlanteans, supposedly in the Atlantic, were technologically advanced but spiritually shallow. The Lemurians, in the Indian and Pacific regions, were spiritually advanced but technologically simpler. It was almost as if the Earth itself had been running a philosophical experiment. As the 20th century unfolded, pop culture began to merge the two. In pulp magazines, comic books, and later television shows, Atlantis and Lemuria sometimes appeared as rival kingdoms, locked in ancient wars that spanned the oceans. In Marvel Comics, for instance, Lemuria is an underwater realm inhabited by the Deviants, frequent antagonists of Atlantis. This fictional rivalry echoes the way fans and fringe theorists sometimes pit the two myths against each other in debates. Which was older, more advanced, or more likely to have left descendants? From a scientific perspective, neither fares well. Plate tectonics explains away the need for a lost continent in the Indian Ocean, and geological records show no evidence of a vanished mid-Atlantic empire. But the resilience of both myths lies in their adaptability. Atlantis can be tied to the Minoan eruption of Thera, to Caribbean ruins, to Antarctica. Lemuria can shift between the Indian Ocean, the Pacific, and even underground realms beneath Mount Shasta. The competition between them seems less about disproving the other than about expanding each one's domain. There's a hypothesis that part of Lemuria's enduring appeal comes from this very comparison. Atlantis, with its long-established fame, draws attention to the whole category of lost continents. Once you've entertained the possibility of one, why not another? Lemuria rides in Atlantis's wake like a shadow ship, familiar enough to feel plausible, different enough to stand on its own. Of course, myths don't have to be mutually exclusive. Some New Age thinkers have gone the opposite route, merging them into a single global civilization. In this fusion, Lemuria becomes the peaceful eastern half of the world-spanning culture, Atlantis the ambitious western half, their eventual clash leading to a planetary cataclysm. It's neat, dramatic, and entirely unencumbered by evidence. Yet even for those who know better, the contrast has its uses. If Atlantis is the story of a fall from power, Lemuria is the story of a loss of innocence. One warns about what happens when a civilization overreaches. The other mourns what the world loses when something gentle is destroyed. And maybe we need both kinds of stories, the one that tells us not to climb too high, and the one that reminds us that some things, once gone, can't be replaced. In the end, Atlantis and Lemuria are like twin mirrors, each reflecting a different version of the same yearning, the desire to believe that somewhere, sometime, the world was whole in a way it isn't now. Whether they were rivals, neighbours, or entirely separate dreams, they both hold a coastline in the mind, a place you can almost see when you close your eyes and listen to the sea. If the story of Lemuria sounds strange enough in the hands of mystics, it takes on an entirely different and far darker tone when filtered through the machinery of 20th century politics. Few regimes embraced myth as enthusiastically, or as dangerously, as Nazi Germany, and in the tangled roots of its propaganda, Lemuria found an unlikely, an unsettling place. To understand how this happened, you have to step into the world of the Ahnenerbe, the SS's ancestral heritage research institute, founded in 1935 under Heinrich Himmler. Officially, the Ahnenerbe's purpose was to study the archaeological and cultural history of the so-called Aryan race. In practice, it was a peculiar mix of genuine research, pseudoscience, and outright mysticism. Expeditions were sent to Tibet, Scandinavia, and even Antarctica, looking for traces of an imagined prehistoric past that could be used to justify Nazi ideology. Lemuria entered this orbit through the same esoteric pipeline that had carried it from theosophy into Western occultism. In the early 20th century, German and Austrian mystics like Rudolf Steiner and Hans Herberger had woven Lemuria into sweeping theories about ancient civilizations, cosmic cycles, and racial hierarchies. In some versions, Lemuria was home to the first humans, tall, noble, spiritually attuned, whose descendants allegedly carried on their legacy in certain pure bloodlines. It was a distortion of theosophy's already problematic racial framework, recast to fit the Nazi obsession with ancestry. An odd fact from this period: in 1934, a German occultist named Hermann Wirth, who would later co-found the Ahnenerbe, claimed that both Atlantis and Lemuria were real, but represented different stages of human development. He placed Lemuria deep in prehistory, its people living in harmony with cosmic forces, until a great disaster forced their descendants to migrate northward. According to Wirth, some of these migrants eventually became the ancestors of the Aryan peoples. There was no archaeological basis for any of this, but in the ideological climate of the time, plausibility mattered less than the ability to weave a compelling origin myth. Historians are still debating whether Nazi interest in Lemuria was more than a fringe curiosity within the regime. While Atlantis featured more prominently in their pseudo-historical narratives, Lemuria appeared in several Ahnenerbe lectures and in privately circulated writings among SS officers fascinated by occult history. One surviving set of lecture notes, dated 1938, links Lemuria to the idea of a primordial Urheimat, a homeland predating all recorded civilizations. Then there's the Antarctica connection. In 1938-39, Germany launched the Neuschwabenland expedition to the frozen continent, officially for whaling reconnaissance. Unofficially, it has been the subject of decades of conspiracy theories suggesting the Nazis were searching for entrances to underground realms that, in some post-war fringe retellings, were linked to Lemurian survivors. In these versions, the Lemurians didn't vanish entirely. They retreated beneath the earth, waiting to emerge when the time was right. It's pure fantasy, but it shows how adaptable the myth can be, attaching itself to whatever narrative needs it. One peculiar story, which surfaced in occult circles after the war, claims that Nazi researchers examined ancient South Asian and Polynesian myths for clues about Lemurian migration routes. The idea was that if Lemuria had been a cradle of advanced humanity, perhaps it left behind scattered enclaves of descendants who still carried ancient knowledge. No documents have ever confirmed such a project, but the rumour persists, feeding the modern intersection between Lemurian lore and conspiracy theories. In the Nazi mythos, Lemuria was often cast as the distant past, a time of purity and spiritual alignment before the degenerations of later civilizations. It was a selective memory, cherry-picking from theosophy and other occult traditions and twisting them to support racial pseudoscience. The gentle, utopian Lemuria of earlier mystics became, in this warped retelling, a stepping stone toward a supposed Aryan destiny. The irony is sharp. A myth born from a zoologist's musings on lemur migration was now being used to justify one of the most destructive ideologies in history. And when the Nazi regime fell, it left behind not just ruins and archives, but a legacy of contaminated myths, stories like Lemuria, which would forever carry the shadow of their misuse. Oddly enough, this dark chapter didn't kill the legend. In the post-war years, Lemuria was reclaimed by New Age thinkers, UFO enthusiasts and channelers, many of whom ignored or erased its appropriation by Nazi ideology. But if you trace the footnotes and the stranger corners of Lemurian lore today, you can still find the fingerprints of that era. The fixation on ancient bloodlines, the idea of a hidden homeland, the blending of archaeology with mystical destiny. It's a reminder that myths are not fixed things, they're tools. In the wrong hands, even the most fantastical of them can be sharpened into a weapon. And Lemuria, despite its soft edges and utopian glow in other tellings, was no exception. If Lemuria had already been stretched halfway across the globe by Victorian scientists, theosophists, and Nazi mystics, then the next leap in its story was the most improbable yet, relocating part of it to California. Not beneath the waves of the Indian or Pacific Oceans, but under the snowy summit of Mount Shasta, a dormant volcano rising like a pale beacon in Northern California. Mount Shasta had long been a place of stories. For the local Wintu, Shasta is sacred, the dwelling place of spiritual beings and the axis of the world. In the late 19th century, as settlers and spiritual seekers moved west, the mountain began to attract a different kind of attention, from writers, mystics and adventurers eager to project their own visions onto its slopes. And it was here, in 1904, that Lemuria's unlikely American chapter began. That year, a British-American writer named Frederick Spencer Oliver published A Dweller on Two Planets, a book he claimed was dictated to him telepathically by a mysterious entity named Philos the Thibetan. The book is a strange, sprawling mix of science fiction, metaphysics, and travelogue, detailing both life in Atlantis and in a technologically advanced society hidden inside Mount Shasta. This society, Oliver wrote, was descended from Lemurian survivors who had escaped their sinking continent thousands of years ago. They had tunneled into the mountain, building vast subterranean halls lit by a mysterious energy source where they lived in peace and spiritual refinement. Oliver's Lemurians were tall, serene, and robed in white. They walked the mountain slopes occasionally, but only to those deemed spiritually ready to see them. Their underground city, Telos, was described as a marvel of crystal architecture, gardens that never withered, and archives containing the history of Earth's civilizations, including proof of Lemuria's existence. It would be easy to dismiss Oliver's account as an eccentric work of fiction, and indeed, many did. But in the decades that followed, the idea took root. By the mid-20th century, Mount Shasta had become a pilgrimage site for those hoping to encounter the hidden Lemurians. Stories circulated of hikers meeting tall, otherworldly figures who spoke perfect English with an odd musical accent before vanishing into the forest. Others claimed to see glowing lights or strange doorways appearing in the snow. An odd fact: in 1931, a man named Guy Ballard, later the founder of the I Am movement, reported meeting an ascended master named Saint Germain on Mount Shasta, who introduced him to spiritual teachings blending theosophy, Rosicrucianism, and American Christian mysticism. Ballard didn't claim his master was Lemurian, but the overlap in mystical geography was enough to keep the legends intertwined. In the decades that followed, other channeled messages from Telos appeared in New Age circles, often with detailed accounts of Lemurian history and philosophy. The hypothesis that Lemurians had fled not just to islands, but into the Earth itself was not new. Hollow Earth theories had been circulating since the 18th century. But Mount Shasta gave this idea a tangible location, a place believers could actually visit. It also added a romantic American twist to what had previously been a largely Eurasian and Indo-Pacific legend. Historians are still debating how much of the Mount Shasta Lemurian myth is an organic extension of Oliver's book, and how much is the result of later embellishment by occult groups. Some suggest that the Great Depression and the uncertainty of the early 20th century made the idea of a hidden, harmonious civilization beneath one's feet particularly appealing. In a world racked by war and economic collapse, Telos became a safe haven in the collective imagination. By the 1980s and 1990s, the Shasta Lemurians had been fully absorbed into New Age cosmology. Channeled Telos messages described them as fifth-dimensional beings, guardians of the Earth, working quietly to guide humanity through its spiritual awakening. Workshops promised to teach attendees how to reconnect with Lemurian DNA. Crystal shops in the nearby town of Mount Shasta began selling Lemurian seed crystals, said to be ancient stones encoded with knowledge from the lost continent. Oddly, even skeptics admit that Mount Shasta has a magnetic pull, literally and figuratively. The mountain generates unusual weather patterns, and its isolated, symmetrical shape gives it an almost otherworldly presence. Whether or not Lemurians dwell beneath it, the mountain has become a sanctuary for those seeking something beyond the ordinary. Of course, from a scientific standpoint, there is no evidence of vast underground cities in Mount Shasta, and no geological mechanism for such a cavern system to exist on the scale described. Yet that hasn't dimmed the legend. For believers, the lack of evidence is part of the point. The Lemurians are masters of concealment, revealing themselves only when humanity is ready. And so, thousands of miles from the Indian Ocean where the myth was born, Lemuria lives on in the shadow of a snowy volcano, a reminder that myths don't just survive by clinging to their original geography. They travel, adapt, and take root wherever the human need for wonder finds fertile ground. If the Mount Shasta Lemurians gave the legend a home address in America, the next step was to give them an entire hidden infrastructure, an invisible, interconnected world beneath our feet. Here is where Lemuria merges with one of the most persistent and strangest branches of fringe lore, the Hollow Earth. The idea of vast underground realms is far older than the Lemurian myth. From the Greek Hades to the Buddhist Shambhala, from the Norse Svartalfheim to the Hopi's underworld emergent stories, countless cultures have imagined subterranean domains. In the 18th and 19th centuries, a more literal version took hold in Europe and America, the Hollow Earth theory, which suggested that the planet might be honeycombed with immense caverns, or even hollow to the core, with entrances at the poles and through certain mountain ranges. By the late 20th century, Lemuria had been grafted onto this tradition. In New Age circles, the Lemurians were no longer simply the descendants of a drowned continent. They were fifth-dimensional beings living in vast crystal cities, accessed through gateways hidden in mountains, ocean trenches, and occasionally in the middle of unassuming forested hills. The most famous of these cities was still Telos, beneath Mount Shasta, but others were said to exist under the Himalayas, the Andes, and even beneath the Pacific Ocean floor. According to these accounts, the Lemurians retreated underground during their continent's final days, not as a desperate act of survival, but as part of a planned transition to a higher state of being. Their cities were designed to resonate with the Earth's energy grid, often described in terms of ley lines, invisible currents of spiritual power connecting sacred sites around the globe. One odd fact from this modern retelling: in the 1990s, several self-proclaimed Telos channelers described an underground transport system, high-speed, tube-like craft powered by crystal energy, linking Lemurian enclaves around the world. They claimed this network could move someone from Mount Shasta to the Himalayas in minutes. No blueprints were ever produced, but the imagery was compelling enough to inspire more than a few works of speculative fiction. Historians are still debating whether the Hollow Earth Lemuria is a direct evolution of theosophy or a separate hybrid myth that merged with it in the late 20th century. Some point to the works of Richard Shaver, a pulp writer in the 1940s who claimed to have visited underground cities inhabited by elder races. While Shaver never used the term Lemurian, his descriptions of advanced ancient beings living in hidden caverns bear an uncanny resemblance to later Telos narratives. For believers, the underground Lemuria serves several purposes. It explains the lack of surface ruins. They took everything with them. It turns the Lemurians into active participants in humanity's present, watching over us from below, and it adds a layer of secrecy and exclusivity. If you've never seen a Lemurian city, it's because you haven't yet earned the right. Oddly, these stories sometimes intersect with modern UFO lore. In certain accounts, the Lemurians work alongside extraterrestrials, sharing technology and acting as stewards of Earth until humans are ready to join the galactic community. In others, they themselves are a starfaring people, their underground cities doubling as bases for interstellar craft. The image of a crystal-domed city glowing softly in a vast cavern, with ships slipping silently through luminous gates, is the sort of thing no amount of geological skepticism can fully erase from the imagination. The hypothesis that Lemuria is accessible only through energetic or dimensional gateways also dovetails with ideas about portals in sacred sites. Some channelers insist that places like Stonehenge, Machu Picchu, and Uluru are all part of the same Lemurian network, not because the Lemurians built them, but because they are aligned with the same planetary energy grid. The gateways, they say, open only during certain astrological alignments, or to those who have undergone specific spiritual initiations. Of course, from a scientific perspective, there is no evidence for such cities, energy grids, or portals. But the Hollow Earth Lemuria persists because it offers an elegant solution to the myth's central problem. If the continent is gone, where did its people go? By placing them underground, the story avoids awkward geological questions and shifts the conversation into a realm where evidence is not expected, where absence becomes part of the proof. In this sense, the underground Lemuria is less about geology and more about psychology. It transforms a lost past into a hidden present. The Lemurians are no longer a vanished race. They are neighbours we don't know we have, guardians of knowledge we aren't yet ready to receive. And for those who believe, the possibility that they might emerge, that the crystalline doors might open, is a promise that the world still holds secrets worth discovering. So, in the cool shadow of mountains, in the imagined glow of subterranean gardens, Lemuria continues. It may not be on the maps, but for those who look for it, it is always just a doorway away. If a civilization leaves no cities, no temples, no tools, and no bones, how do you prove it ever existed? For some believers in Lemuria, the answer is simple. You look for its language. Words, after all, can travel farther than people. They can cross oceans, change shapes, and still carry the shadow of an origin long after the place itself has vanished. The idea of a Lemurian language began modestly in theosophical writings of the late 19th century. Helena Blavatsky hinted at symbolic scripts and primal sounds used by the Third Root race, suggesting that fragments of this ancient tongue had survived in Sanskrit, Polynesian, and certain Native American languages. Later writers expanded this into full alphabets and vocabularies, often with no linguistic basis beyond a good imagination and a flair for exotic-looking letters. One of the most famous examples comes from the 1930s, when James Churchward, better known for his books on the lost continent of Mu, published supposed examples of Nakal writing. These looping geometric characters, he claimed, had been preserved on ancient tablets in India and were related to the scripts of other lost lands, including Lemuria. Critics pointed out that Churchward never produced the tablets, and his script bore suspicious similarities to decorative art motifs of the time. Still, the idea of a shared mother script linking Lemuria, Mu, and even Atlantis proved irresistible in occult circles. An odd fact: in 1965, a New Age group in California published the Lemurian Scrolls, claiming they were telepathically received from Lemurian elders. The book included not only English text but a parallel translation into a series of ornate glyphs. These glyphs, with their spirals and nested triangles, had the deliberate feel of a designed script rather than the organic messiness of a natural language. But for believers, their very aesthetic was proof of ancient sophistication. Historians are still debating the origins of these modern Lemurian scripts. Some suggest they are heavily influenced by known alphabets, Tibetan, Devanagari, Rapa Nui Rongorongo, filtered through an Art Nouveau lens. Others see them as purely symbolic, never meant to function as a real writing system, but as a kind of spiritual sigil set, each character representing a concept rather than a sound. The hypothesis most often voiced by fringe linguists is that echoes of Lemurian speech can still be found in living languages. They point to odd similarities in vocabulary between Malagasy in Madagascar and Polynesian languages, or between Tamil and distant Austronesian tongues. Mainstream linguists explain these as the result of known migration patterns, Austronesian sailors reaching Madagascar around 1,500 years ago, for example. But in the Lemurian frame, they become scattered shards of an ancient linguistic mosaic. In some New Age workshops, the Lemurian language has evolved into what practitioners call light language, streams of phonetic syllables chanted or spoken during meditation, believed to bypass the rational mind and speak directly to the soul. To an outside listener, this can sound like glossolalia or speaking in tongues, but to those in the room, it's a reawakening of a dormant memory. "You've always known this language," one channeler insists in a recorded session from the 1990s. "Your DNA remembers it, even if your mind does not." Oddly, the belief in a Lemurian script has sometimes crossed over into the world of pseudo-archaeology. The undeciphered Rongorongo script of Easter Island, with its intricate line-carved glyphs, has been claimed by some to be a surviving fragment of Lemurian writing carried east by refugees. Mainstream scholarship firmly places Rongorongo within the Polynesian cultural sphere and dates it to the 18th or 19th century, but for believers, its undeciphered nature is enough to keep the connection alive. The absence of physical artifacts has only fueled the language hunt. With no ruins to examine, every unusual word, every unexplained petroglyph becomes a candidate for Lemurian heritage. Cave inscriptions in California, possibly Lemurian. Strange symbols on coral blocks in Micronesia could be Lemurian. Even unusual markings on crystals sold in New Age shops are sometimes said to be Lemurian code, waiting for the right soul to read them. From a scholarly standpoint, the search for a Lemurian language is an object lesson in confirmation bias. Start with the assumption that such a language must have existed, and you'll find patterns everywhere. But from a mythic standpoint, it's a way of keeping the story alive. A language, even an invented one, gives Lemuria a voice. It makes the continent feel less like an abstract landmass, and more like a place where real people once greeted each other, argued, sang, and told stories. And maybe that's the deeper truth of the Lemurian language myth. It isn't about phonetics or syntax, it's about connection. It's about imagining a thread that runs from the deep past to now, not in stone or bone, but in the sounds we make when we're trying to speak to something beyond ourselves. Whether written in spirals of gold ink carved into coral, or spoken softly in the half-light of a meditation room, the words of Lemuria remain just out of reach, a conversation half overheard from a place we can't quite see. By the time the 20th century gave way to the 21st, Lemuria had been claimed by mystics, colonized by nationalists, appropriated by fringe theorists, and relocated under California's most photogenic volcano. But in the halls of universities, the story took a very different turn. Science, at last, had the tools to address the question in a way that neither Victorian zoologists nor theosophical adepts could, and in doing so it quietly dismantled much of the myth, though, as with all good myths, not enough to erase it entirely. The key to the scientific unravelling of Lemuria was plate tectonics. The theory had been gestating since the early 20th century, when Alfred Wegener proposed continental drift in 1912, but it wasn't until the 1960s that seafloor mapping, paleomagnetism studies, and the discovery of mid-ocean ridges brought the full mechanism into focus. The continents were not fixed. They floated on the semi-fluid asthenosphere, moving centimetres per year, colliding, rifting and reshaping the face of the planet over hundreds of millions of years. This single idea was enough to solve the mystery that had prompted Philip Sclater's Lemuria in the first place. Madagascar and India did not need to have been connected by a land bridge in the recent past. They had both been part of the supercontinent Gondwana more than 100 million years ago, long before lemurs or humans existed. Their shared species were not evidence of a drowned land, but of ancient common ancestry followed by long periods of isolation. The evidence for this is layered and compelling. Identical fossil species found on continents now separated by oceans, the fit of continental coastlines like puzzle pieces, matching geological formations across thousands of miles, and the symmetrical patterns of magnetic striping on either side of mid-ocean ridges, showing where new crust had formed as plates drifted apart. Oddly, this scientific clarity didn't entirely kill the Lemurian idea. If anything, it gave it a new, subtler foundation. The 2013 discovery of Mauritia, a fragment of ancient continental crust buried under the volcanic island of Mauritius, proved that pieces of continents could indeed sink beneath the sea over geological timescales. Mauritia was no Lemuria in the theosophical sense. It was small, uninhabited, and gone tens of millions of years before humans arrived. But for believers, it was a tantalizing see, it can happen moment. historians are still debating how much of the modern Lemurian revival owes its persistence to this kind of selective reading of science. Many New Age books and websites cite plate tectonics not to disprove Lemuria, but to suggest that mainstream geology admits continents can vanish, sidestepping the inconvenient matter of timelines and scale. Genetics has added another layer of clarity and complexity. Studies of human mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome markers have mapped the migration routes of our species over the past 70,000 years. They show clear patterns. Humans left Africa, moved along the coasts of Asia, reached Australia, and much later crossed into the Pacific. These patterns leave no room for a missing Indian Ocean supercontinent in the timeframes relevant to human habitation. But they also reveal unexpected connections, like the Austronesian genetic influence in Madagascar, which some fringe writers weave into Lemurian narratives as the legacy of a seafaring, continent-spanning culture. Archaeology, too, has chipped away at the gaps that once sheltered the Lemurian myth. Submerged cities off the coast of India, like those at Dwarka, have been shown to be relatively recent, their submergence due to rising seas after the last ice age. Mysterious megaliths in Madagascar are linked to known local cultures. Each proof of Lemuria dissolves under careful excavation. And yet, and here's the strange part, the myth refuses to vanish. It has adapted, shifting from physical to metaphysical terrain. For some, Lemuria is no longer a literal landmass, but a vibrational field, a parallel dimension overlapping our own. In this form, it cannot be disproved by sonar maps or carbon dating. It exists outside the reach of physical tools. An odd fact, even some scientists, when speaking off the record, will admit that the deep ocean floor still hides surprises. Less than 20% of it has been mapped in detail. Hydrothermal vents, undersea volcanoes, and deep trenches are still being discovered. While none of this suggests the existence of Lemuria, it does mean that the ocean retains a measure of mystery, enough for a determined imagination to slip through. The hypothesis that myths like Lemuria persist because they serve psychological needs is gaining traction in anthropology. We seem to crave lost golden ages, places where humanity was wiser, gentler, or more in harmony with the earth. Science may strip away the geological plausibility, but it cannot erase the longing. In the end, the scientific verdict is clear. Lemuria, as a recent habitable continent in the Indian Ocean, never existed. But the persistence of its story, in New Age workshops, in online forums, in whispered conversations at the foot of Mount Shasta, is a reminder that myths live on not because they are true, but because they are needed. And sometimes, what we need is not a map, but the possibility that somewhere, just beyond the edge of proof, there's a piece of our history still waiting to be found. If you strip Lemuria of its maps, its supposed ruins, its improbable lemurs turned giants, what's left? Strangely enough, something even more enduring. The part of the human mind that invents places like this in the first place. When the geology is gone and the evidence dissolves under scrutiny, Lemuria survives because it was never entirely about rocks and fossils. It was always about longing. Lost continents sit in a peculiar corner of the human imagination. They're not quite heaven, not quite utopia, but they carry a similar emotional charge, a sense of wholeness that feels absent in the present. Atlantis promises technological mastery before the fall. El Dorado promises endless wealth. Lemuria promises something gentler, harmony, balance, and a kind of ancient wisdom that we've supposedly forgotten. The hypothesis that myths like Lemuria are born from cultural memory, echoes of real events like the flooding of coastal lands after the Ice Age, has its appeal. But there's another theory, and it's less about geology and more about psychology. We create lost lands to fill the gaps in our own narratives. Those gaps might be in science, in history, or in the way we see ourselves. In the 19th century, Lemuria filled a scientific gap. It answered a zoological puzzle in the absence of plate tectonics. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it filled a spiritual gap, offering theosophists a stage for their cosmic drama. In the 20th century, it filled a cultural gap, serving as a kind of symbolic homeland for Tamil pride, or an emblem of New Age ecological harmony. And in every era, it filled the personal gap for people who wanted the world to be more mysterious than the maps allowed. Historians are still debating whether myths like Lemuria arise spontaneously across cultures, or whether they spread and mutate like stories passed from hand to hand. Some flood myths, for instance, seem nearly universal. Did they emerge independently from local disasters, or did the idea itself travel along ancient trade routes? The same question can be asked of lost continent stories. Are we wired to imagine a vanished place, or is it a meme that keeps resurfacing in different guises? One odd fact about human cognition: we're prone to completist thinking. When we see a broken circle, we imagine it whole. When we see fragments of a statue, we imagine the missing pieces. Applied to history, this instinct makes us restless with empty spaces on the map. If we know there were great civilizations here and here, why not here in between? If we see similar symbols in Madagascar and Polynesia, why not imagine a missing bridge between them? Psychologists suggest that such myths endure because they offer what reality rarely does: resolution. The real world is full of stories without endings, cultures that vanish without explanation, ruins whose builders are unknown, artifacts whose purpose we can't decipher. A lost continent ties up the loose threads. It's a single, elegant answer to a tangle of unrelated mysteries. Of course, there's a more personal side to it. For some, Lemuria becomes a private refuge. New Age workshops often describe it not as a place that can be found on Earth, but as a frequency or state of consciousness one can enter. In this sense, Lemuria is less like a lost continent and more like a personal Eden, a safe place in the mind reached through meditation, where one can imagine walking along golden shores under an unspoiled sky. Oddly, this psychological Lemuria can coexist with the geological impossibility. A person might fully accept that plate tectonics disproves the idea of a recent Indian Ocean supercontinent, yet still visit Lemuria in dreams or guided visualizations. In this way, the myth has migrated from the outer world to the inner one, where it's impervious to sonar scans or radiometric dating. The persistence of Lemuria also speaks to our need for connection. Many of its modern retellings emphasize unity, of people with nature, of different human cultures with one another, of the present with the deep past. In a fractured world, imagining that there was once a place where harmony was the norm is both comforting and motivating. If such a thing existed once, perhaps it could again. In the end, Lemuria may tell us more about ourselves than about any hypothetical landmass. It's a mirror we've been carrying for 150 years, one in which each era sees what it wants to see: scientific curiosity, spiritual yearning, cultural pride, ecological idealism. And in that sense, Lemuria isn't really lost. It's right here, every time we look at the world and imagine the missing pieces. The ocean is the perfect accomplice for a myth. It conceals, it distorts, and when it does give something back, it delivers it draped in just enough mystery to keep the story alive. Underwater archaeology is a discipline built on patience, method, and meticulous recording. But in the popular imagination, it's often reduced to the romance of treasure and ruins. And it's in that gap between careful science and sensational hope that Lemuria still finds its footing. Over the past century, a number of real underwater discoveries have been drafted into the Lemurian narrative, often with little regard for context. The pattern is predictable. Divers or fishermen stumble upon an unusual formation, word spreads, photographs circulate, and almost immediately someone suggests that this must be part of the lost continent. One of the most famous examples is the Yonaguni Monument, lying just off the southern coast of Yonaguni Island in Japan's Ryukyu chain. Discovered in 1986 by a local diver, the massive underwater structure features step-like terraces, broad flat surfaces and sharp edges that seem almost too clean for nature alone. Some geologists argue it's simply a product of tectonic uplift and erosion in sandstone, while others, including a handful of archaeologists, suspect at least partial human modification. For Lemurian enthusiasts, the debate is irrelevant. If Yonaguni is artificial, it proves the existence of a prehistoric maritime culture. If it's natural, it still proves the ocean can create shapes that fool even experts, leaving room for other, more deliberate ruins to be hidden elsewhere. Thousands of miles away, off the coast of Gujarat in India, lie the submerged ruins of what some call the Dwarka of Krishna. Sonar mapping and underwater excavation have revealed structures, walls, and artifacts that suggest human habitation before parts of the city were claimed by the sea. Most archaeologists date the ruins to around 3,500 years ago, tying them to known periods of coastal flooding. For those inclined toward Lemuria, Dwarka becomes not just an ancient port but a surviving outpost of the continent's eastern edge. An odd fact, in the Seychelles, a diver in the 1970s reported finding a road of large, flat granite blocks stretching for dozens of meters on the seabed. Later investigation suggested these were naturally fractured granite outcrops, but photographs of the find still circulate in Lemurian literature as the Granite Causeway. Historians are still debating how much harm these speculative connections do. On one hand, they can inspire public interest in underwater archaeology, leading to more funding and exploration. On the other, they can muddy the waters, so to speak, encouraging the idea that every submerged feature is part of a global lost civilization, rather than the product of local history and geology. The temptation to link unrelated sites is strong. Nan Madol in Micronesia, an above-water city built on artificial islets, is sometimes folded into Lemurian lore simply because it's impressive and in the Pacific. The Bimini Road in the Bahamas, though more often linked to Atlantis, occasionally gets borrowed into Lemurian narratives when a storyteller wants to suggest a truly global civilization. There's also the persistent hypothesis that certain megalithic sites on land, especially those with no clear cultural attribution, were once coastal cities that are now isolated relics of a much larger maritime network. In this view, the great stone structures of Easter Island, the Moai, are just the visible tips of a Lemurian iceberg, the rest of which lies under the surrounding sea. Underwater archaeology itself resists these leaps. The field depends on context, artifacts, organic material for dating, cultural layers built up over time. A carved stone on the seafloor is only meaningful if you can show how it got there, when, and by whose hands. But myths like Lemuria thrive on isolation. A lone artifact stripped of context becomes a talisman of mystery. Oddly, there's an inversion here. The better underwater archaeology becomes, the less room there is for Lemuria. Side-scan sonar, remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, and photogrammetry have revealed ancient shipwrecks, drowned towns, and long-forgotten trade, routes, all tied to known cultures and time periods. The blank spaces where Lemuria might hide are shrinking. Yet paradoxically, each new discovery rekindles public imagination. If we can find this, why not something even older? Some believers adapt by shifting the terms. They argue that Lemuria's remains are not in shallow coastal waters, but in the deepest parts of the ocean, far beyond current exploration. Others claim the ruins are cloaked by silt, hidden by tectonic shifts, or even deliberately concealed by guardians, a recurring theme in Mount Shasta and Telos lore. In truth, the ocean does still hold vast unknowns. Only a fraction of the seafloor has been mapped in detail. Strange, isolated features, seamounts, plateaus, trenches, emerge from the darkness and surprise scientists every year. Most of these finds tell a geological story rather than a human one, but the psychological space for Lemuria remains. The unknown is a door, and the sea with its currents and shadows is very good at keeping it slightly ajar. So when a diver surfaces with news of a wall, a step, or a road where none should be, the legend breathes again. The archaeologist might see natural rock. The Lemurian seeker sees a signpost pointing to a shore no ship has touched in thousands of years. And in the realm of myth, that's enough. By the time Lemuria had drifted from science into mysticism, from mysticism into underground realms, and from there into the restless imagination of underwater explorers, it had also quietly infiltrated a third territory, pop culture. Unlike the Indian Ocean, the Pacific, or Mount Shasta, this was a place where no one cared whether the lost continent was real. Here, Lemuria could be anything: a pulp adventure setting, a villain's lair, a paradise to be saved, or a mystery to be solved before the credits rolled. The first wave of Lemurian fiction arrived in the pulp magazines of the early 20th century. Writers like Robert E. Howard, creator of Conan the Barbarian, wove it into the background of their invented histories, where it stood alongside Atlantis, Mu, and other lost lands in sprawling pre-human epochs. In these stories, Lemuria was often a place of sword and sorcery grandeur, great marble cities, warrior priests, and terrible sorcery that inevitably led to its downfall. It was less Theosophy's gentle utopia and more a stage for epic drama. Oddly, some pulp authors swapped Lemuria's location freely, moving it to the Pacific or even the Antarctic to fit their plots. The flexibility of the myth meant no one blinked when Lemuria appeared alongside dinosaurs or alien invaders. By the 1930s and 40s, the word itself had become shorthand for exotic and lost, a brand name for the kind of forgotten realm where anything could happen. Comics picked up the thread. In Marvel's continuity, Lemuria became an underwater kingdom inhabited by the Deviants, a race of genetically altered beings at odds with both humanity and Atlantis. This Lemuria was militaristic, mysterious, and deeply entangled in cosmic plots. In DC Comics, Lemuria appeared as a long-sunken city tied to the sorceress Queen Clea and the Amazonian mythos. Neither version bore much resemblance to Sclater's zoological land bridge, but both cemented Lemuria as a pop-cultural peer to Atlantis, familiar enough to recognise, undefined enough to reinvent at will. In film and television, Lemuria's appearances have been rarer but memorable. The 1973 sci-fi film The Bermuda Depths hints at Lemurian survivors manipulating events from beneath the sea. In the animated Thundar the Barbarian series, 1980-82, Lemuria is part of the shattered geography of a post-apocalyptic Earth. Japanese tokusatsu shows have sometimes used Lemuria as an ancient super-science civilization responsible for kaiju-scale technology. Video games have embraced the myth most freely. In the Final Fantasy franchise, Lemuria or Lemurian-like continents appear as floating islands or hidden lands, accessible only through magic or advanced technology. In strategy games like Civilization VI, Lemurian ruins are flavor text for mysterious bonuses. Indie games have also leaned on the name, using it for everything from underwater research facilities to surreal dreamscapes. Historians of popular culture are still debating why Lemuria never reached the same saturation as Atlantis. One theory is that its name lacks the instant familiarity. Atlantis has a clear, ancient Greek origin, while Lemuria sounds more obscure and scientific. Another is that Lemuria's lack of a fixed geography makes it harder to anchor in a single iconic image. This very looseness, however, may be why it endures in genre fiction. Creators can reshape it without fear of contradicting a canonical version. An odd fact: in the 1970s, the Lemurian myth was adopted by some psychedelic rock bands and counterculture artists, who used it as a symbol of lost wisdom and cosmic harmony. Album covers featured pastel-hued continents rising from the sea, crystalline temples, and robed figures with serene, knowing expressions. For a subculture exploring altered states of consciousness, Lemuria became shorthand for a kind of mystical homecoming, a world before the fall. In modern New Age media, Lemuria is often portrayed as a civilization that still exists, vibrationally, offering guidance through channeled messages. Entire YouTube channels are dedicated to Lemurian healing and Lemurian light codes, blending the myth into personal spirituality. This modern spiritual Lemuria bears little resemblance to pulp adventure settings, yet they share the same root, a continent freed from the constraints of physical evidence. The hypothesis here is simple. Once an idea enters pop culture, it gains a kind of immortality. It no longer depends on believers or on evidence. It depends on storytellers. And Lemuria, with no fixed boundaries, no ancient texts in the archaeological record, and no universally accepted canon, is the perfect blank canvas. Of course, the pop cultural Lemuria is a chameleon. In one story, it's a paradise. In another, it's a sinister empire. It can be utopia, dystopia, mystery, or metaphor. And while these reinventions often strip away the details of its theosophical or Victorian origins, they keep the name alive, which is in the long run what myths need most. In the end, Lemuria's survival in fiction mirrors its survival in belief. Both thrive because the continent is undefined enough to be anything. You can drown it, move it, populate it with gods, aliens, or ancient astronauts, and it still works. It doesn't need to be found on a map to be found in a story, and as long as there are stories, Lemuria will never sink completely. If you've followed Lemuria's trail this far, you've travelled a long way, from a Victorian zoologist's study to tropical islands and volcanic plateaus, from temple ruins to crystal cities deep inside mountains, from sonar-mapped seafloors to pulp magazines and pixelated video game worlds. It is a journey across more than a century of imagination, shifting seas of evidence, and the deeply human tendency to stitch together fragments into something whole. And perhaps that's the real territory of Lemuria, not the Indian Ocean or the Pacific, but the wide and restless landscape of the mind. The Lemuria we began with was modest. Philip Sclater didn't dream of psychic giants or interdimensional cities. He simply wanted to explain how lemurs ended up in Madagascar and India. The Lemuria we end with is anything but modest. It is a fluid myth that has adapted to science, resisted it, absorbed it, and found new life in art, spirituality, and conspiracy theory. It has been a utopia, a warning, a symbol of pride, a set for adventure stories, a vibration you can tune into, and a secret that some insist is still waiting under the waves. Historians are still debating the value of such myths. Some dismiss them outright as distractions from real history. Others argue that they serve a purpose, functioning as cultural mirrors that reflect our hopes, fears, and ideals back at us. And in Lemuria's case, the mirror is unusually adaptable. To the Victorian scientist, it reflected a desire for neat, logical solutions to nature's puzzles. To the theosophist, it reflected a yearning for a purer, more spiritually connected humanity. To the nationalist, it reflected an unbroken link to a glorious past. To the New Age seeker, it reflects the possibility that wisdom and harmony still exist, hidden in plain sight. An odd fact about the human brain: it resists empty spaces. We are storytellers by instinct, and when we see a gap, in history, in geography, in the fossil record, we want to fill it. Lemuria has been one of the grandest gap fillers of all, a single elegant solution to 100 unrelated mysteries. And even as the science has erased the need for it, the myth has refused to sink. The hypothesis that Lemuria is, and always was, a psychological continent makes sense in this light. It is the embodiment of what if, the place we imagine when the present feels incomplete and the past feels too small. And because it's built from stories rather than stone, it cannot be eroded by waves or buried by sediment. Today, if you stand on a shore anywhere between Madagascar and India, the map tells you there is only ocean between. But in another kind of map, the one drawn in half-remembered dreams, in the margins of old books, in whispered conversations at New Age gatherings, there's still a coastline out there. There are still mountains, rivers, cities, and people waiting to be remembered. And maybe that's the enduring truth of Lemuria, that it exists not where we can dig or measure, but where we choose to believe. It is not a continent you can sail to, but one you can always arrive at, if you know the way through your own imagination. So now the tide has gone out, and all the noise of the story has quieted. You can let the names drift away: Skleta, Blavatsky, Mount Shasta, Mauritia, like shells rolling back into the surf. The ocean is dark and the sky is wide. Somewhere, the last light is slipping below the horizon, and the air tastes faintly of salt. You might picture the shape of that missing land, the one we've been tracing in memory and myth. Not a perfect outline, not a map you could fold and carry, but a softer image. Green hills under a gold sky, long white beaches, the faint hum of voices speaking a language you almost understand. It isn't rushing toward you. It isn't receding. It's just there, steady, patient, as if it has been waiting all along. The longer you look at it, the more it blurs, until you can't quite tell where the sea ends and the land begins. That's all right. In dreams, borders are less important than the feeling of having arrived somewhere you've always known. Let that feeling grow. Let it fill in the spaces between your thoughts until you can feel the warm sand under your feet and the breeze moving over your skin. You can leave the questions for another time. You don't have to prove anything here. The shore fades, the sound of the waves becomes the sound of your own breathing, and the last light softens to a glow behind your eyelids. Somewhere beyond the edge of sleep, Lemuria is still there. Not in the ocean, but in the quiet space you've carried with you all along. Good night.